pot film. What are you fellas going to do in pot film?
We're a big-time vaudeville act.
Well, I'll bet you're good.
Hello, and welcome to episode 36 of the Laurel and Hardy podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Vasey, the editor of the Laurel and Hardy magazine and the author of the forthcoming book, Laurel and Hardy Silence. On today's show, we begin our look at Laurel and Hardy's second talking picture, Berth Marks. Now, I say we begin our look at Berth Marks due to the fact that I'm splitting the coverage of this film over 2 episodes. And this is because when the time came to record the conversation with my guest Glenn Mitchell, Glenn unfortunately fell ill with COVID, and then I fell ill for about 3 weeks, which put me completely out of action. Since then, Glenn and I have frustratingly been unable to find time together to record our discussion, mainly because we're both now deeply involved in a new and exciting Laurel and Hardy project that we've both been asked to contribute to, which has quite a pressing deadline. Now, we'll give you more details about that when we can. But not wanting to leave it any longer before I posted a new podcast, I decided to at least post part 1 of the show, which is my audio essay on the film. Then hopefully in a few weeks I can get mine and Glenn's discussion published as a part 2. So I hope that makes sense. Patrons of the podcast, you will have already heard the essay as I posted this on Patreon a few weeks ago. And speaking of Patreon, I'm just about to start uploading a new series of exclusive podcasts in which I share some archival materials related to Stan and Babe that I'm sure you'll find very interesting indeed, but that probably wouldn't make it in full onto any particular show. Now, this could be portions of particular books from my collection, or they could be full articles from contemporary trade papers talking about Laurel and Hardy and or the Hal Roach Studios or anything related. But if you're anything like me, and I'm pretty sure you are, I'm sure you will find them fascinating. So, as I say, these will be standalone podcasts exclusive to patrons who have signed up to either the Lower Elements tier or the Plumtree tier. And if that sounds like something you'd be interested in and you're not already a member of my Patreon page, then just visit laurelandhardyfilms.com/podcast and you'll find the link to Patreon and you can join today. And we've had a flood of new members joining both of the tiers that I've just mentioned, so a huge thank you and welcome to the podcast to James Garner, Ricky Riccardi, Anna Di Pangracio, George Mazzi Sr., Warren Harmon, Andrew McMinigal, John Littlewood, Brian, Ben Wink, Andy Graydon, Keith Larson, Greg Nestor, Doug McWhirter, David Scott, Paul Copping, John, Bob Duncan, W.M. Keith, Will Smith, Bonnie Lassiter, and Jason Anders. So 1,000 thanks to all of you for joining. Your support really does mean so much to me, and I hope you enjoy the exclusive podcasts and the magazines that you're now able to get access to. So that's our little preamble over for today. We'd better get a move on, because we've got a train to catch. Today's film in focus is Berth Marks. It was filmed April 15th to April 24th, 1929. It was also released on June 1st, 1929, produced by Hal Roach, directed by Lewis R. Foster, and photographed by Len Powers. With filming completed on the first all-talking comedies for each of Hal Roach's main series, Laurel and Hardy, Our Gang, Charlie Chase, and the All-Stars, one can imagine the unified sigh of relief exhaled by the entire team at the studio. However, there was no time to sit back and reflect on a job well done, as the production schedule demanded work begin immediately on the next round of pictures. Quote, Roach plans 12 talkers in next 2 months. With the 2 sound stages complete at the Roach studio, plans are being made for the production of 12 talking comedies, which are to be completed within the next 2 months. That was from the Film Daily, April 8th, 1929. All units were now a little wiser from the experience of making their first talkies, and yet they couldn't be totally sure just how successful their efforts had been. Stan and Babes, Unaccustomed as We Are, wrapped on April 1st, and the fourth and last of Roach's first talkies, the All-Stars Hurdy-Gurdy, followed suit 5 days later on April 6th. Yet wide-scale public reactions to those pictures wouldn't start to be received for at least another month, with the Laurel and Hardy film not being released to theatres until May 4th. Despite the lack of public feedback to work with, Stan and Babe's second talkie had to begin shooting on April 15th to ensure the studio remained on track to deliver its quota to MGM. In the meantime, all they had to go on was the handful of previews arranged by the studio, and the reactions to those proved invaluable. Quote, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, the Hal Roach Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer teammates, have found what they assert is a happy medium for a combination of sound and silent pantomime in their two-reelers. We are making silent films with accompanying voices, Laurel explained, not talking pictures with action to carry the conversation. When the first Laurel and Hardy talkie was previewed, the audiences laughed so loudly that many of the best comedy lines were never heard. The pantomime of the two clowns proved to be more interesting than their voices. When Stan wrinkles up his face in his grimacing weeping and Oliver pompously struts his mincing way into havoc, the audience doesn't care much whether they talk or not. To make them laugh is the main thing, Hardy said. If they laugh at our foolishness, why bother them with a lot of conversation? We've found too that they will try to stifle their chuckles in order to hear what we're saying, and that's not good for the comedy. So we're going to give them plenty of action and just enough conversation to carry the story, Laurel added. The one big thing about those talking pictures is that we don't have to make the audience wait for the reading of titles. The action can go right on without a break and therefore be faster and funnier. Laurel and Hardy started out to make their first talkie, Unaccustomed as We Are, from a regular continuity script with written dialogue. After the first day, they threw the papers away and went back to their silent way, letting the dialogue and action develop naturally as the story advanced. We never know until we actually get into it what's going to be funny and what isn't, Laurel explained. The gags that look the best on paper often fall the flattest in the shooting. Of course, it works the other way too. It's the same with dialogue, so we're just going to improve as we go along and hope for the best. In making their first talkies, the Laurel and Hardy company talked over the action of each scene, rehearsed it once, and then shot it. They believe that more than one rehearsal takes the edge off the comedy and makes it stale. End quote. And that was from the Indianapolis News, May 18th, 1929. At the Hal Roach Studios, all hands were on deck. Following Leo McCary's departure, Warren Doan and Hal Roach had assumed the task of supervising all of the studio's productions. And now, as their ship negotiated the uncharted waters of the talkies, Doan and Roach rolled up their sleeves and each took on the responsibility of directing one of the studio's lead series. Hal Roach personally directed 3 of the first all-star talking comedies, and Warren Doan, the studio's general manager for the past 10 years, took charge of directing Charlie Chase's first 7. For Laurel and Hardy, Louis R. Foster returned to the directorial chair for the 4th time in a row, and together with Stan and the Gagmen, they drafted a loose storyline for the team to work with under the working title In Vaudeville. The simple plot casts the boys as a couple of vaudevillians making a rail journey with their double bass, or fiddle as they describe it, to a place called Pottsville, and almost all of the action is centered around their exploits on the train. The studio's official press sheet suggests that the story was inspired by Stan's own experiences whilst travelling during his days as a music hall vaudeville comedian. Quote, before starting his screen career, the versatile Mr. Laurel spent many years trouping his native England, the continent and the United States with vaudeville and variety shows. With Charles Chaplin, Stan was a member of the company of Fred Karno's London Comedians, which came to America in 1910 to present its classic act, A Night in an English Music Hall. Many times during his long and varied travelling career, Stan suffered the trials and tribulations endured by the 2 vaudevillians of Berth Marks. His memory of the day of crowded journeys in narrow upper berths formed the basis for this laugh fest of A Night in a Pullman Car. End quote. Berth Marks is indeed a return to their silent formula, with minimal dialogue and a strong emphasis on physical gags. Incredibly, whilst unaccustomed as we are was understandably recorded in the heavily controlled environment of the studio's sound stages, Roach's technicians felt confident enough with the new equipment to begin filming Laurel and Hardy's second picture out on location. The opening scene takes place on the Moorish-style Santa Fe La Grande station platform, located in the downtown Los Angeles area. The station, which opened on July 29, 1893, with its picturesque architecture, was a popular filming location and was already familiar to one half of the duo. In July 1918, Stan Laurel filmed on the exact spot with Frank Terry and Noah Young during the opening scenes of Hustling for Health. This was the last of 5 one-reelers that Roach had recruited Stan to make in place of Toto the Clown, who had broken his contract and deserted Roach's Rollin film company. Once filming on the one-reeler had wrapped, Roach dismissed Stan, and after a short stint making 3 pictures with Larry Semin at Vitagraph, he reluctantly returned to the vaudeville stage. In the 11 years that followed, Stan was able to cement his place in the upper echelons of Hollywood's top comedians, and after reuniting with Hal Roach, became one of his biggest stars. In addition to the Laurel and Hardy unit filming at the Santa Fe station, Bob McGowan and the Our Gang kids were simultaneously shooting a railway picture entitled Railroading. Not content with sharing a location, the 2 films also shared a locomotive. The AT and SF, Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, locomotive number 1373 was a Pacific locomotive built around 1913 with a 4/6-2 wheel arrangement. It featured most prominently in the Our Gang comedy, but is visible in Berth Marks as it pulls into the station, ready for Stan and Ollie to somewhat chaotically jump on board. If filming outside and maintaining good sound recording levels wasn't enough of a challenge for the crew, Stan and Babe's scenes in Berth Marks were shot in very public areas. In the days before sound recording was even a consideration, crowds could assemble behind the cameras watching the action unfolding and even provide supportive laughter and cheers to the comedians without any impact on the filmmaking process. It became very obvious very quickly that crowd noise and laughter could ruin a take. As Laurel and Hardy's popularity grew, so did the number of fans that came to watch them at work. It wouldn't be long before local police officers were needed to be employed to keep the noisy throngs quiet. Harold Lloyd remembered when he first stumbled across a theatre playing a talking picture. The biggest laughs came from everyday noises such as frying eggs in a pan or ice cubes clinking in a glass. It was therefore quickly understood how important a realistic audio track would be to sound films, whether for comedic purposes or simply for realism. So, to ensure an authentic soundtrack to both Berth Marks and Railroading, Chief Sound Engineer Elmer Regis and his team went to great lengths to record real train noises such as whistles and rumbling trucks and the sounds of the carriages clinking and clacking along the tracks. One of the best uses of sound and dialogue in Berth Marks comes in the opening sequence. The station's platform announcer unintelligibly reels off the destinations of the locomotive currently sitting in the station.
Where have you been? I've been looking all over for you. All it! All aboard!
What do you say?
Eager to board the correct train, Ollie asks the announcer,
Does this train go to Pottsville? Keep your ears open.
He retorts and repeats his garbled announcement for the benefit of Stan and Ollie.
All aboard! All trains going west. Overhaul,
This is just as impossible to understand the second time around, and the boys' expressions wonderfully express their concentration and attempts to decipher the words, and then finally their bemusement and resignation. Ollie politely waits for him to finish, smiles, and with a note of sarcasm says,
Thank you.
This type of gag would not have been possible in a silent picture, and perfectly illustrates the creative ways the new sound medium could be exploited for comic effect. Apart from the opening location scenes, and in contrast to Our Gang's railroading, the majority of Berth Marks was shot on the soundstage back at the Roach lot. To maintain the sense of realism, the studio craftsman built a full-size replica of a Pullman carriage, complete in every detail and equipped with regulation furnishings. The completed car had everything except the wheels. Once on the train and their journey underway, the boys steadily and unwittingly cause havoc in one of the Pullman coaches, beautifully built by the Roach craftsman, leaving a trail of chaos and destruction in their wake. A carriage full of passengers is left to a crescendo of violence as they attack each other, ferociously tearing their clothes, in a nod to the reciprocal destruction endings of Stan and Ollie's silent era. Yet, this is not the film's finale. Much of the film is taken up with the boys' disastrous efforts to climb into their upper sleeping berth, and then, once inside on the cramped bunk, their ridiculous attempts to change from their day clothes into their sleepwear. As only Laurel and Hardy can, they quickly become entangled in each other's sleeves and trouser legs. Ollie becomes exhausted and exasperated through his efforts, and Stan displays his childlike cries of frustration and hurt as Ollie's patience inevitably snaps.
Get your foot out of my face. And don't crowd. Why don't you stay on your own side? Will you quit crowding? Would you mind get over further? Don't crowd. I'll look like a mackerel. Get that thing off of my foot. Give it to me. I won't be bothered with that.
The completed sequence lasted for approximately 5 minutes, and according to legend proved to be incredibly problematic to film due to the comedians and the entire crew being unable to stop laughing hysterically at Stan and Babe's comic antics. Propman Thomas Benton Roberts recorded the events for posterity in his memoir. Quote, "They were trying to make a shot once of the action of climbing into the upper berth of one of George Pullman's Pullman cars with their suitcases and large musical instruments. They did get undressed down to their longies, and then unintentionally, of course, Stan, in his manoeuvring around, would get his foot through the back door of Babe's wardrobe. Well, Babe, being a bit touchy in his posterior, would almost tear that rolling stock into shreds. It took 3 days to get this shot with straight faces." End quote. Later, in conversation with film historian Randy Skretvet, Benton Roberts expanded further. Quote, "They'd get to laughing, you know. Stan would get his foot in Babe's underwear. He didn't do it on purpose, he just couldn't see what he was doing. And as he went to stretch out, his foot went in and goosed Babe, see? They'd get to laughing and then they'd go out and play, to get it off their minds. And of course, we were wasting film. So they'd come back the next day, set up, shoot it again, then they'd break down and laugh again. 3 days they worked on that thing." End quote. In addition, Len Powers, the film's one and only cameraman for this shoot, also recorded his memories of the hilarity surrounding the making of Berth Marks in an October 1929 interview in American Cinematographer. Quote, "From Powers we learned the secret of this pair's success. Summed up, it is simply this: the pair just act natural. Sometimes, explained Powers, I can't do a thing for laughing as they start to ad-lib. The funniest gags are pulled at these moments, and no one could ever be funnier than they are when they once get started. I remember in Berth Marks, most of the very funniest stuff was absolutely devised on the spur of the moment by Stan and Oliver. They got started and we couldn't stop them, and that sequence was side-splitting. One reason why I say they are the funniest men in pictures is because after photographing them all day, I can't resist going into a theatre and watching them on the screen at night." End quote. Finally, the boys change their clothes and lay their heads on their pillows, and at that precise moment, having finally settled, the train guard announces the next stop is Pottsville. Cue a frantic scramble to grab their belongings and disembark. As the train pulls out of the deserted Pottsville station, we see Stan and Ollie standing on the platform in their underwear, arms full of clothes, and wearing each other's derbies. With the locomotive disappearing in the distance, Ollie realises they've left their fiddle on the train. Now, having lost their sheet music in Santa Fe, and with no instrument to play it on anyway, there's only one person who can take the blame.
Where's the fiddle? Sure. Now, wait a minute now. Now, don't lose your temper. It was your fault that you put the thing under the seat. I told you not to do it. Now, wait a minute now, will you? Hey, now, wait. Hey!
The location of the pretty buildings used for Pottsville Station was in reality the Palm Station, built in 1887 and conveniently located just 2 miles north of the Hal Roach Studios. Sadly, the Palm Station was permanently closed just 4 years later in 1933. In 1976, the station's historic buildings were rescued and relocated for posterity and preservation to a new home at the Heritage Square Museum in Los Angeles. Just as there was a great level of pride shown for the historic station buildings of Berth Marks, there was equally as much, if not more, pride demonstrated for the actual town of Pottsville by one former resident. Quote, "Pottsville in movies, vaudeville artists in talkie bound for our town." Reading, Berks County, was derided as a hick town in the movie Broadway Melody. Now, Pottsville, Queen City of the Anthracite, is relegated into the same category by the talking screen. Such, at least, is to be inferred from the talking comedy Berth Marks, now playing at the Capitol Theatre. 2 vaudeville actors, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, leave on a tour of the tank towns. As they board a sleeper for their first stop, Pottsville, they plainly speak the name of this city. The name Pottsville creeps into the conversation of the 2 comedians several times. The conductor of the train shouts, "Pottsville!" through the train door as they approach the station. The movie comedy even takes a close shot of Pottsville's railroad station. Audiences at the Capitol were literally knocked out the aisles by the unusual skit. The title, Berth Marks, accrues from the difficulty experienced by the hulking Hardy and the moronic Laurel in squeezing themselves into an upper berth. The following appears in one of the columns of the Scranton Sun. "Dear Fanny, I'm in a terrible stew. Don't know what to do or whom to sue. Spent all afternoon looking through a newspaper directory of the United States and Canada, and if someone doesn't soon come to my assistance, I will just not be responsible. That's all. It all happened like this. Wanted to see a movie this week, and got to the theatre during the showing of the comedy. Yes, I laughed just as loudly as the rest of them, and at times became quite boisterous, much to the chagrin of the master, who never has been known to digress from her accustomed poise. But I tell you, if you haven't seen Berth Marks, well, you just ain't heard nothing yet. Funny? Well, everything was going along screamingly fine when the porter in the picture announced, 'All out for Pottsville.' Having spent the happiest years of my life in that city, I immediately sat up and took notice, eyes and ears and probably my mouth too, all open, when lo, and behold, what to my wondering eyes did appear but a 2x4 frame boxcar with the appellation of Pottsville in bold type above the door. Why, do you know, the tears came thick and fast, and to make matters worse, when the train pulled away from the station, the very grass was depicted as covering the ties and running along the tracks. Mad? Oh, you don't know me. One look at the station was a burlesque. I felt like the fellow who had ordered a serving of watermelon and had melon supreme served him, which, as you know, contains 1 or 2 small pink melon balls. In the first place, Pottsville has 2 lovely brick stations just across the street from each other, and I tell you I never did see one single blade of grass within at least 2 squares of either station. With a population of over 21,000 of God's chosen people, 3 daily newspapers and industries consisting of packing houses, foundries, tobacco, brass, lumber, knit goods, shoes, shirts and powder mills, in addition to being the county seat of Schuylkill County, don't you think one would be justified in raising an objection? As I said above, I have scanned every page in the 1929 newspaper annual and directory to see perhaps if there is another Pottsville, but the closest I can come to it is Pottsville in Iowa. Do you know of any other in these United States? You being yourself a Pottsvillian, could you advise me your opinion regarding my communicating with the Victor Company, makers of the comedy, just to satisfy my curiosity? Sincerely yours, J.R.R. P.S. The most unkindest cut of all is that it is being portrayed on posters in front of the theatre where all passers-by who haven't got the price to go inside are just being given a terrible impression of my hometown. Isn't it just too bad? End quote. And that was the Pottsville Evening Republican, August 28th, 1929. In addition to complaints from ex-Pottsvillians, and even though Stan and Babe's colleagues confirmed just how much disruptive laughter the birth sequence caused during filming Berth Marks, the film was still awarded a bum review from one of the leading trade papers. Quote, "It's a strange thing, but even the mighty have their weak moments. This Hal Roach comedy is an example of how a slim idea can be stretched too far. Even if the stars are Laurel and Hardy and the reels are supplied with the Walker brand of titles, this comedy flops just the same. It even gets monotonous. Can such things be with a Laurel and Hardy opus? The boys, who are this time musicians, get on a Pullman with their grip overflowing with sheet music and a bass viol of customary girth. The two of them tried to go to sleep in the narrow upper berth, and the comedy consists for the most part of medium and close-up shots of the pair in the agonies of undressing. There's nary a variation until their station is called, and they gush out, leaving their fiddle behind. Even the great nod once in a while. That must have been the reason why this two-reeler, which, by the way, has very little talking, is not up to the usual Roach standard." End quote. And that was Motion Picture News, October 5th, 1929. Modern-day critics have also been equally as scathing of Berth Marks. William K. Everson said, "One of the few really poor comedies that the team made. This is a misfire all down the line." Glenn Mitchell, "The upper berth scene is stretched beyond audience patience." And Leonard Maltin, "Berth Marks, probably the worst short they ever made, owing largely to a prolonged sequence of the boys trying to get undressed in an upper berth of a train. The scene seems to go on forever, and to make matters worse, no one bothered to write any dialogue, so Ollie repeats over and over again, 'Will you stop crowding?'" However, and once again proving the subjectivity of entertainment, despite the odd bad review, the majority of the movie-going public and exhibitors in 1929-1930 afforded the picture praise and positivity. Quote, "A special treat on the programme this week is Berth Marks, the hilariously funny, all-talking comedy featuring Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. These clever comedians are surely the peers of mirth, and capital audiences are delighted with their efforts, evincing their pleasure in continuous laughter and rounds of applause." That was in the Wilkes-Barre Times Leader from August 28, 1929. A rare treat for comedy lovers is Berth Marks, the latest laughing efforts of those inimitable funsters Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. The mirth these clever entertainers provoke is indescribable and can only be appreciated by attending the show and seeing and hearing for oneself. That was from the Evening News, August 29th, 1929. Berth Marks is also a side-splitter. It is remarkable how much comedy Laurel and Hardy can get out of the proposition of undressing in the sleeping car. That's what the thing is all about. That was the Yonkers Herald, September 26th, 1929. Berth Marks, a very good comedy that was laughed at by my patrons. Recording on disc, very good. That was the Real Joy Theatre, King City, California, in Exhibitors Herald World, February 8th, 1930. Berth Marks, fair comedy. Laurel and Hardy always go over good here. Recording on disc, good. That was the Lark Theatre, McMinnville, Oregon, in Exhibitors Herald World, March 5th, 1930. And the last one, Berth Marks, a comedy that kept our patrons in a roar. Disc recording good. from the Manchester Theatre, Wisconsin, in Exhibitors Herald World, May 3rd, 1930. In reality, the studio must have been satisfied with the picture and the resulting response from contemporary audiences as parts of the comedy, including the much maligned sequence in the upper berth, would be reused, with a few modifications, in the boys' first feature-length outing, 1931's Pardon Us. It would also be recycled for arguably the best scene in The Big Noise 15 years later. In addition, practically all Berth Marks footage was reused and incorporated into the extended foreign language versions of the Laurel and Hardy murder case 12 months later. Instead of the boys riding the train to Pottsville, though, they were instead on their way to Ebenezer Laurel's mansion to stake Stan's claim to the inheritance. Although some sequences needed to be reshot entirely for the film to make sense, much of the footage used consisted of existing Berth Marks scenes. The change from focusing on dialogue to reverting to emphasising visual gags was a sensible move for the Roach comedies, especially for Laurel and Hardy. One further example of relative satisfaction with the tweaked model of comedy production is a surviving correspondence between Hal Roach and David Lowe. Lowe, the son of Marcus Lowe, the founder of Lowe's theatre empire and one of the leading men responsible for bringing together and establishing Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. David Lowe, as vice president of Lowe's Incorporated, was an important ally, mentor and advisor to Roach, especially during this challenging period transitioning to the talkies. On April 30th, 1929, a few days after shooting Wrapped on Berth Marks, Roach wrote to David Lowe to seek his highly valued opinion. Quote, "Please keep me posted on what you think of the quality of our old dialogue comedies. We seem to be progressing pretty well out here, and not much different than making silent pictures." End quote. A week later, Lowe responded to Roach. Quote, "I saw your first all-dialogue comedy with Laurel and Hardy. I think it is very good, and I expect it to go down very well with the audiences. I think the standard they have set in the past is kept right up with this one, though some around here do not agree with me. You just keep on making a standard, and the other fellows will start petering out as they usually do, and you will hold the same position with the dialogue comedies." End quote. Roach's confidence in producing talking pictures grew as each week passed, and with good reason. His main assets, Laurel and Hardy, were taking to the talkies like ducks to water, and their third talkie would be a real walk in the park. So that's part one of our look at Berth Marks over and done with. Look out for part two, my chat with Glenn Mitchell, all about the film, coming up in the next few weeks. And don't forget, if you want access to even more Laurel and Hardy podcasts, you can just visit patreon.com or go through the link on laurelandhardyfilms.com/podcast and follow the link direct to my Patreon page there. So until next time, it's goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye.
And a very goodbye from me. Goodbye.